Everybody, Alex Kapitko here, centered from Reality Podcast, and it is Wednesday morning. Sorry I didn't do a Monday episode. I just had one of those days where things got busy, and I wanted a few days to kind of see what was happening around, to comment on stuff, just because there is so much going on right now. So sometimes you just need a day to sit back, take it off. Well, I didn't take it off, but you guys get the gist. Well, anyways, spring is starting to sprung here. It's like about 60 degrees, which is kind of nice. Still, who knows? In a couple days, it'll probably be blowing ice and snow again. That seems to be the case. But hey, things are starting to look up. The weather's warming up. I can see the sun more. Days are getting longer. All good news on that front. Today, though, I want to start by talking about China, more specifically Shanghai, which is a huge financial hub in China, huge city of about 25 million people. And I just want to talk about why the zero COVID strategy is kind of slowly falling apart, in my opinion, and the opinion of others as well. And I also want to just talk in more detail about why I think zero COVID is becoming more political than actually a public health issue. It's about control, order, and stability in China. And I also think it's about kind of keeping to a promise that it gave to the people. I just kind of want to argue through this that I think the zero COVID policy is kind of part of this social contract in China. And the Chinese government, if they're not able to at least have the image of getting it done, it could cause some chaos. So I will start with just kind of a recent update from Monday, so 2 days ago. Again, before we start, I apologize if there's any background noise. The street here is always busy no matter what time of day. I've been sleeping horribly because of that. But anyways, so on Monday, Bloomberg reported in quotes here, the U.S. ordered all non-emergency staff at its Shanghai consulate to leave China. This, of course, infuriated China and has not helped our current spat over everything. And what they mean here is that, the U.S. basically has left Shanghai, or all of our diplomats and non-emergency staff has left, mainly because of kind of this breakdown in available resources, these draconian lockdowns, and it's kind of made the city unlivable, full of chaos, and the quality of life is going down pretty quick. And, of course, China's saying, oh, this is you guys just standing up against us, it's all politics, it's disrespectful. I don't know, if I was locked in my apartment for 2 weeks and couldn't even go out to get food, maybe prescription drugs I need, I would also probably want to get out of there, to be honest, but maybe that's just my opinion. But the article goes on. The State Department ordered the departures Monday, according to their website, as most of Shanghai's 25 million residents were restricted to their homes for at least 2 weeks. The article writes here in quotes, anger has risen over food shortages, the inability to access medical care, and even pet killings. More on the pet killings later, because it does appear to be happening. At first I thought it was just a social media story, but apparently they're killing your pet if you test positive for COVID and have to go away for 2 weeks. It just looks like Shanghai is kind of not doing too well, I guess you could say. So first off, I think we need to put this into context here. This is the largest shutdown or lockdown in China since Wuhan, back at the beginning of this whole shit show. And Wuhan, in comparison to Shanghai, only has a measly, 11 million people, more or less? And Shanghai is more than twice that size, at 25 million. And it's a huge financial hub, and I'm almost assuming that part of the reason for this lockdown is because it's so busy. It's a fairly international city. It's a place where a lot of people come and go, and so it's obviously a great place for something like Omicron or the new variant of Omicron to spread, right? And anyways, this lockdown in Shanghai has been going on for over 2 weeks now, and from what I've gathered, this is the biggest outbreak that has occurred in China since the pandemic began. And now we've seen some other ones in recent weeks in Hong Kong and Taiwan as well. And part of the issue here is that the zero COVID policy is just becoming nearly impossible. And that's mainly just due to the transmissibility of Omicron and the other variants that have come after it. To put this into perspective, COVID was running through the U.S. like wildfire over the holidays. And so many people, including myself, got it. And if you were vaccinated, healthy, and I even know people that were unvaccinated that still had barely any symptoms, as long as they were usually young and healthy. And if you were any of those, even with Omicron, even if you got it, you barely had any symptoms, and people did fairly well with it, even older groups of people. And I think there was a shift in the U.S. during the holidays in mindset. And what I mean here is that people, including myself, had avoided COVID up to that point. And all of us got it, right? And I think it shifted from me thinking, I'm going to try and never get COVID. I'm not going to be afraid of it, but at the same time, I really don't want to get it. And I probably won't get it. I've made it this far. And after the holidays and after Omicron, I think it went, we're all going to get it at some point. And so it was this big mind shift in the U.S. And we also saw this in places like the U.K., Sweden, Denmark, where they've kind of said, get vaccinated. They also, side note, have higher vaccination rates than us. But anyways, that was kind of this shift where they're like, we're not going to be able to just get rid of COVID, so we're going to live with it. And while this was happening, China has stayed with the zero COVID policy, even when Omicron is very difficult to stop. And now China, from what I've gathered here, basically freaks out if there is a single case of COVID or even a little bit of spread in their cities. And once they detect enough cases, the city is pushed into these draconian, severe, authoritarian lockdowns that we've not really seen evidence that work. All they're going to do is just hurt vulnerable people, piss off the population, and probably lead to a decline in mental health, right? And I think the problem with this whole policy, especially in the Shanghai lockdown, is that the government just can't seem to separate a positive test from severe cases. Because from what I've been reading is that they are treating any positive test like it's a big deal. And this is just not sustainable in this world. Even if China is doing the most stringent policies necessary, a lot of positive tests mean nothing. Like, I've been saying this for months, is I think we need to find a way to separate positive tests from actually severe COVID, because honestly, testing positive anymore is not a good indicator of what's going to happen to you. And it's just becoming kind of a nightmare for China, because their main measure of COVID success is cases. And Omicron has kind of shifted that completely. So getting back to what's been occurring, basically a few weeks ago, the city went into a very quick and sort of half-assed lockdown that just almost happened overnight. And a lot of the population just was not properly prepared and warned about how bad the lockdown would be. So from what I've been reading from The Economist, CNN, Bloomberg, and The Atlantic on this, is that people just didn't stock up enough on supplies, and they were just not prepared. And we have to remember, it was the same when I lived in Europe, is that in the U.S., people kind of buy for the week, or they go to Costco and get a bunch of stuff to last them a couple weeks. But in a lot of these other countries, people go to the market every day or every couple days. And I think that's been the case here in China, is that there's not all these frozen meals people keep. People need to keep getting more and more supplies. They need to get the supplies and the food for a day or two. And they can't leave their houses to do this. And it's becoming kind of difficult to actually get stuff delivered. And people have to stay in their residential compounds, even to buy food. And obviously, if the city's in lockdown and there's a shortage of people, it's going to be hard to get all these supplies to everyone. And apparently they've been stretched very thin, and it's put just extreme pressure on the entire system, from hospitals to food delivery to just daily services. And that Bloomberg article from earlier writes, in quotes here, "For many people, the restrictions are becoming more distressing than the threat of the virus." And that's interesting to hear coming out of China, because usually I think kind of a trend along this pandemic is that a lot of the Chinese people have been pretty willing to go along with government recommendations. And the fact we're seeing people are getting angrier and distressed about these lockdowns, I think tells us that something big could be happening here. And, it just comes back to what we've been seeing in hindsight in the West, is that there's multiple studies, including a great one from Johns Hopkins, that talks about how the lockdowns did not particularly stop the spread. And if they did, it didn't seem to make up for the other social impacts that were hit by it. And I guess China's obviously not reading any of these reports, but it is interesting. And there's also more worrying and tragic things happening as well. I have read, which is just fascinating and dark, I've read multiple stories, real stories, about pets just being killed. Apparently, what happens to your pet if you test positive is this troubling gray area. And from what I've gathered, so say I test positive, I go to a holding area in a hospital for those that test positive to wait out the quarantine. They'll treat you, I guess, if need be. And so if they take me to the hospital and say I have a dog, apparently they either just let the dog go or sometimes they've just euthanized them, killed them. There's a report I saw online where one animal was recently killed with a shovel by a person in a hazmat suit. I think that, I mean, that just tells me so many things here. It's like, I just don't think that would even fly in the United States or in a lot of Europe. If people heard about that, there would be massive social upheaval. But this apparently seems to be happening, and that's just such a violation of people's private property, their rights. But again, I think the emphasis of those particular elements are not as big there. And there's also videos of people screaming at community workers, begging for food, people begging of starvation. The Economist also has an article from Thursday that was talking about how there was just a lack of medicine and prescription drugs. There's an interview with the daughter of an older gentleman from Shanghai who apparently has cancer and has been clearly struggling getting enough during this lockdown, and he's thinking about suicide. And so we're also seeing this now as despair, desperation. It's not particularly good, and these are all these side effects, especially if you do such draconian lockdowns. Like, even my lockdowns in Spain during the beginning of it, it was nothing like this where you can't even leave the house to get food, you know. And The Economist also has a really interesting passage that I'll read here. It says, in quotes, "People have also been angered by the leaked recording of a phone call purportedly between a Shanghai resident and an official from the local office of the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention. On the call, which The Economist has not verified, the official says Shanghai's policies have been driven by political considerations, not public health concerns. She says that coordination between hospitals has been poor and that medical supplies are running low. People with mild or no symptoms should quarantine at home," she suggests, contradicting the local official policies. She also says tests have been rigged to show negative results in order to free up capacity in the overwhelmed health system, while appearing to adhere to the government's zero COVID mandate. End quotes. And obviously we can't verify if all this call is true, but even if the call itself isn't completely verified, all of it makes sense, right? I can totally imagine that this is a political, not health crisis. It seems like in a lot of ways, especially for places like Hong Kong, the zero COVID policy has been somewhat of a loyalty test. It's like, even if you're finding a way to mask your positive cases, we need to continue the guise of adhering to this policy. And there's a great Economist article from back in February. I recommend people to read on that, how it's like you're either open to the world or open to China. And yeah, China's been very strict on this. And it's also been China's model from day one. And I think President Xi needs to keep these promises because he is going to be involved in an election for a third term, which election, I don't know if that's the best word to use for this, because unless there's just some crazy act of God, he's going to be the president again. But there's also the fact, I think, that the Chinese people have a very unique social contract with the government. While in the West, you think about the social contract between the American people, for example, and the government as protecting freedoms and liberties and serving as a watchdog against tyranny and harm and personal violation. Protecting people, basically. But in China, there seems to be more of a mutually agreed upon situation where the people are not going to rise up or fight back against the government when maybe it restricts free speech online or controls the flow of information or bans certain apps. And the people won't stand up to that as long as the government's able to provide them with good living standards, safety nets, stability, a better life than their kids. And I think until now, that contract has been fulfilled in some ways because obviously the middle class has just exploded in China. They are investing a lot on public infrastructure. But then at the same time, the people, they are not allowed the same transparent information as, say, I have access to right now. And so far that's worked, but I think we're seeing that start to crumble in places like Shanghai, where the government is now controlling the people, lying to them, and not providing them with adequate resources to get by. And to add to this problem and actually maybe give some defense to China, which I usually don't do. The other problem here, which I do think needs to be mentioned at least, is that vaccination is quite low in China. And that's surprising because China's not some like anti-vax, anti-COVID country where like the US is divided over COVID. China's not. It's that I think zero COVID has lied to the people. The people have thought we don't need to get the vaccine because our government is taking care of COVID. And the fact that we have seen some huge spikes around China right now in cases is worrying. And I think that's why the government is taking such extreme lockdown measures, is because they know that if this gets out of Shanghai and spreads throughout the country, there could be millions of deaths because the Sinovax, from what I've gathered, it's about 52% efficacious. That's the word. It's about 52% efficacious against Omicron. And the older population, which is even worse, are really not vaccinated at high levels. And I think it's because there's the perception that they really didn't need to be because the government is keeping COVID out. And like I said at the top of this segment is that Omicron has kind of changed that. And so China kind of needs to, in a sense, win this small battle over COVID in Shanghai so it doesn't become a war in the entire country against it. Because I think we would see severely high death numbers. I mean, I've seen numbers in India close to 1 to 2 to 3 million people dead just because of the population density and the living standards, just everything, and the poverty, lack of health care, etc. And China's a little bit better off than that, but the vaccination rates are quite low, and the vaccine is not quite effective as they were hoping. So I do think that when you put it into that perspective, like the Chinese government is really struggling to deal with COVID. Now, if they were a more transparent, open society, I think it would be easier for there to be a shift in trajectory or a shift in policy about what they're trying to do. But it's really hard when you're in a country like this to do that.